Welcome to the Up Podcast, raw real talk on everything young parenting.
From self-care, co-parenting, and family planning, to balancing school, work, relationships, and goals.
Together, we're challenging society's assumptions and building a safe and supportive community for young parents.
One honest conversation at a time. So join us on the journey.
Hey guys, welcome back to another Yup podcast. Today we are going to be talking all things reproductive rights. As always, it's Divine.
And I'm Brandy, and back with us again for like the I can't even count time is Justice.
Hi.
So excited always. Y'all, I know I said this before, but y'all don't understand. Like, this group is just so special to me. And so we are excited to always be able to dive into these conversations. Today's conversation, we might be on a roller coaster, just FYI. So buckle up and hold on tight. Okay, so let's just get right into it. We know with media, with social media, with election talks coming up, all different sorts of things, there's a lot going around about reproductive rights, about women's rights, about the right of women to control their own bodies and their own decisions for family planning and all the things. And so, as we know, the concept of abortion is sometimes a highly controversial and, tough topic for people to talk about. But we want this space to really be a space where we can open up about those experiences, debunk some of that stuff, and also just talk about the stigma and the shame and all of that. So we can kick it off. Justice, I know that you have some really unique perspectives. I know that you have shared some of this on our website and stuff like that. So can you start us off just kind of talking about this topic and your own personal journey with abortion and female, reproduction and all that?
Sure. So I will start this off by saying that before I was actually put in the position of deciding to have an abortion or not, I was one of those people who have always kind of been pro-choice, but I was like, pro-choice, but I would never do it that was my political stance with it. And then I was put in the position where I had to choose what I was going to do and what my next steps were. And I think that really humbled me and helped change my perspective on it. So just to provide context, I have a 2-year-old daughter, and when she was 9 months old, I had gotten pregnant again. And I knew right away that I didn't want to be pregnant. I wasn't going to keep the pregnancy. And at the time, my partner at the time, we kind of went back. Well, he kind of went back and forth of like, we should keep it, or, this is not necessarily a good thing, but I guess he was trying to approach it as a sign. I don't know what sign, but I guess he was trying to look for the positive. But I had a very hard pregnancy, emotionally, mentally, all of the things. Financially, I didn't bring my daughter into the best situation, and I knew the next time I got pregnant, I wanted it to be a lot different. So obviously, having gotten pregnant so soon after having my daughter, I had a lot of emotions. Like I said, immediately when I saw that the test was pregnant, I was like, I am not keeping this pregnancy. I said that to my partner at the time. It like he had asked like, well, what do you want to do? And I was like, well, what do you mean? What do I want to do? Like, I'm gonna get an abortion. And that, for me, like I said, being someone who was like, oh, people could do it, but I'll never do it. Life has a funny way of humbling you. And I think when it comes to abortion and the talk of like pro-choice and pro-life, I think for a lot of people, it is one of those situations where you think it's never going to be you until it's you. And that was my experience. I never thought that I was going to be put in a position like that. So like I said, I knew right away I wanted to have an abortion. There were many factors, like I said, at the time that I got pregnant again, we were living with my parents. I was like in the thick of postpartum, breastfeeding. And so I already had a lot of stress. I wasn't working. So I was like, how am I gonna, bring another baby into the situation? I don't have an income. And things just weren't very stable in my relationship, my life, anything to responsibly bring another child into the situation. And like I mentioned, my partner at the time, he was more so on the side of like wanting to keep the pregnancy. His politics were a little bit different than mine. Um he was like, people can do what they want, but like I don't think that is right type of stance. Um and so I think that was what was behind his hesitancy and his like I guess drive and desire to want to keep the pregnancy, but um that just wasn't enough for me. Unfortunately, he wasn't doing enough, I wasn't doing enough at the time to, like I said, responsibly bring another baby into the situation. And so I think I was like, I want to say like probably like 2 seconds pregnant, and I called Planned Parenthood and scheduled an appointment immediately. Like I was not playing. I was so dead set on like having the abortion, terminating the pregnancy. And with that came a lot of emotions. I would say I felt relieved, but I also felt a little guilty. And also just a little embarrassed because I'm like, my daughter's only 9 months, we were irresponsible. How could this happen? I kind of felt like I took on a lot of the embarrassment because I was the one who had to go into the office and talk to the doctor and take the medicine. And they weren't performing abortions locally to me. So I had to drive somewhere else, which was like an hour and a half away. And um I didn't tell, like no one knew that I was pregnant in my family, so it was like just a secret that my partner and I had kind of kept. And so the day of the abortion, it kind of felt like I was like sneaking around almost, like no one knew where I was. And I had a medical abortion, so I had taken pills to terminate the pregnancy, and I kind of felt like I had to experience that in silence. The pain, the bleeding, the recovery process, because no one knew. Because again, like you mentioned in the beginning, there's like this shame or this taboo around it, where I felt like if I tell people, they're gonna think that I'm like, and they're gonna think I'm irresponsible. They're gonna think I'm embarrassing, or so I just felt like this cloak of shame that I had to wear by myself. And while my partner at the time supported me through that process, I do know in the back of his head he had the crazy idea and want to keep the pregnancy, but I just knew that that wasn't ideal for us and it wasn't responsible for us. And I knew personally as a mother, I knew the quality of life I want to give my daughter, and I knew bringing another child into the equation would definitely change that. And I wouldn't be able to be the mom that I want to be to her. I wouldn't have been able to be the mom that I wanted to be to that baby. And so I think in my experience, there were a lot of emotions. But all in all, I'm very happy and content with that. But like you said, it still is very taboo to talk about and filled with shame, I think.
Yeah.
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 I mean, thank you for even being willing and vulnerable and comfortable to come on our platform to talk about it. Because to this day, it is taboo. It is a big secrecy. And I think it's also important to mention how every situation, every pregnancy in general, every abortion case can be completely different.
Yeah.
I know for myself, our situations were a little opposite, where although, abortion was a choice for humans, it wasn't necessarily a choice for me. I was kind of forced into going into the procedure from
Mm-hmm.
my parents, the other parent, the other parent's parents. So it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't necessarily something that I consented in. Looking back at it now, I'm able to, be appreciative. I don't think it necessarily would have changed anything because I ended up pregnant very shortly after. But in that moment, it was a big thing for me. I didn't have that voice, but now to just even imagine my daughter in my shoes, or
Mm-hmm.
yourself and any other young woman out there, just even having a choice is so much power of its own.
Mm-hmm.
And I just remember that day, like you said, you are the one walking into the building walking in to take the medicine, talk to the doctors. You're the one verbally and physically responsible for the decision that you're making. Can we talk a little bit about like what that day was for you mentally, physically, just walking into that office, and if there's any aftermath of like PTSD from that experience?
Yeah, so the day of the procedure, I was anxious. Not only because of the procedure itself, but like I said, my daughter, Legacy, she was still little. So, like I said, we had to travel about a half hour or an hour and a half away for the procedure. And so I was just worried on like her in the car ride. And then with me taking the medication, I kind of had to take a pause in breastfeeding her. So I was trying to figure out like how that was going to work and how she would be. And um we, like I said, we were living with my parents at the time, and not that they had like ever questioned my whereabouts, but I was like, depending on how long we're gone, like, is someone gonna get suspicious, like, are they gonna ask me? And so there was like a lot of thoughts going through my head. I definitely think the overwhelming feeling was just I was anxious. Once I got to the place, to the clinic, I was a little bit more settled because I started to feel a sense of relief. Like, okay, like I'm going to come in here, I'm going to get the help that I need, I'm going to take the medication, and I'll be done with this. Like, I won't have to think about it. It'll be past me. Um, and I think one of the biggest things that I realized with that experience is that it is not at all how like the media or like books or magazines or like old advertisements make it sound. Like, you're not walking down like a dark back alley. It's not like you're not going into a clinic with like posters of like these morbid images. You're not sitting down with doctors who are like encouraging you to kill your baby. Like, that's not at all how it was for me. In fact, I was asked by several providers if I was sure I wanted to do this. Like they did like a mental health screening, they did a series of questions, they like a quick counseling, and they ask you a series of questions. It's not as like, I think a lot of times the media makes it seem like you can just like cash in on like an abortion at any point of the time, and like you kind of just walk into the clinic and walk out and you've aborted a pregnancy. It's not as simple as that. It's also not as dark and as scary as that either, because the providers that I met with at the location I went to were very kind. They were very patient with me. They asked for informed consent. So when they did my ultrasound, they asked if I wanted to see the ultrasound picture, if I was comfortable, like knowing specific details. So I think they really cared about my mental state. And one provider, even like I voiced how I was just embarrassed, and she's like, you don't have to be embarrassed. Like, this happens more times than not, where people, it's an accident, it's a slip up, and she's like, it doesn't make you a bad person. And she also validated, she's like, it doesn't make you a bad mom either. Like, this has happened. You're not the only woman, and you won't be the last woman, unfortunately, that this happens to. And so it was very it was a mix. Just like when I found out I was pregnant, it was the same day. It was the same kind of emotions the day I went for the procedure or the medication. Just a mix of emotions. I think after I left, I felt more relieved than I did anxious. Like I said, just knowing that like I was going to take the medicine, and that part of my journey was going to be over. I did feel a little bit of grief, just like me personally wondering, like, would it have been a girl? Would it have been a boy? What would they have been like? But like I said, I just was so like, I felt so strongly on the fact of like, I cannot do this. Like, I cannot. And even now to this day, like, I'm a single parent. I moved back home with my parents, and I'm like, one of the smartest things I could do right now is not get pregnant. Like, is not get pregnant. And that's just not even for financial purposes, but also my mental health, also just my life. I don't want another child right now. I'm like content with how I am and my little family with just me and my daughter. And I think there's a lot of like beauty in that, just being content with where you are. And also just a lot of like, it takes a lot of strength to be like, that's not what I want for myself. And as women, I think we need to practice that a little bit more, because if I would have allowed my partner at the time to convince me to keep the pregnancy, and then we're no longer together. So I would have been a single mom to two babies. Like that's not what I want for my life. That's not. And so I'm just glad that I stuck to my gut and I knew that that's not what I wanted for my life. And like I was saying, like I think as women it's really important that we know and we are headstrong in the sense of like what we do want for ourselves and what we don't want for ourselves. And that should go with, across every sector of life, especially bringing children into the world, because one of the things I always say is like you can't force motherhood on anyone. Like you
Yeah.
can force a woman to have a baby, but you cannot force her to be a mother. Like that's not something that you can force or bully somebody into. It takes a lot to come into that identity. Um, which is why I feel so strongly about women having the option to choose. I think they should be able to choose whether that's aborting a child, keeping a child, whatever the choice is. I think that women should have it.
Yeah. Thank you both just for your vulnerability. I want to go back to something that you said, Justice, in the beginning, where you were like, I used to be that person that was like, yes, everyone should have a choice, but that couldn't be me.
Mm-hmm.
And as somebody who hasn't necessarily experienced abortion directly, I have, friends and family members who have, and obviously two people in front of me that I, care about deeply. But it's interesting because I was that person, right? That was like, yes, pro-choice. I feel like everyone should have a choice about everything in their life. But I also subscribe to that thing of like, but you get an abortion if you had these circumstances, if the child was conceived through like sexual abuse, if
Mm-hmm.
whatever the thing is. And it's like, well, is that truly pro-choice, right? Or is it pro-choice only if you meet these standards?
Right.
And so it wasn't until I started to really like do the research and do the work and start to really understand that like it's okay that maybe I haven't experienced that yet, but it's okay to also broaden my horizons to your choice to do anything at any point. And
Right.
and so I really appreciate you all talking about that. I also appreciate just the transparency of what the day looked like, what the relief felt like, what the grieving looked like, because
Mm-hmm.
I think people don't understand. You're right. You see the pictures of like people protesting outside and you're filled with shame, or you see the pictures of like people, really deeply grieving. But I think that sometimes people don't feel worthy of also feeling relief and also feel
Right.
like secure and content in their decision. It's not
Mm-hmm.
always this traumatic thing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I really appreciate that perspective. But like even just moving into shame and stigma and looking at just what is kind of circulating now. I know in the last several years, for the last few years, we've seen an overturning of Roe v. Wade, which for those who are not familiar what that was a landmark decision by the US Supreme Court in which the court ruled that the Constitution of the United States generally protected the right to have an abortion. So across the entire United States, women were protected in their decision to have an abortion or not to. And so the overturning of that essentially put that decision in the hands of the states, right? And so you may be in a state where, like I am in California, and California is a state that has vowed to always keep abortion legal and accessible, right? But there are other places that that's not the case. And I want to go back to something that you said where you had to drive an hour and a half even to receive the services. And perhaps that wasn't due to anything, with Roe v. Wade, I'm not sure, but just being in an area that either it's accessible or it's acceptable. Um, we are seeing things in the media where people are bleeding out in parking lots, right? And that may not be, it may be exaggerated or it may not be. But my
Mm-hmm.
thought is just that the idea that people, even if they need to have, like a DNC or something because they have retained tissue from a miscarriage or whatever it is, and the idea that physicians are scared to see where
Mm-hmm.
that falls under. Like, does that fall under abortion? If I were to serve this person, would I
Mm-hmm.
be subject to like criminal
Right.
investigation or something? And
Mm-hmm.
so it's scary to think that people are having to drive super far. People are having to make decisions to do things or to bleed out, or to, some people have lost their lives. Some people have been close to losing their lives because of just the lack of access. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. I wanted to talk about what that looks like, how you all are feeling. I know all of us have daughters here, all in different stages of of their development, but the idea that our children, our daughters could be in this position, and as women, it all falls on us, right? All pregnancy prevention falls on us. It's like, because we're the ones that become pregnant, we're responsible for the birth control. We're responsible for negotiating condoms. We're responsible for everything that happens after an abortion. We have to talk with our families. We have to deem ourselves worthy of being a parent. Like all the things that fall on women that could potentially impact our children. So what are y'all's thoughts about that? All of the things. My head is just all over the place because it's so heavy, you know?
In my experience, I did have to travel, but that wasn't anything like specific to my state. It was just like in Lancaster, so in my city, there was a Planned Parenthood. They just weren't offering abortion services at that location. So that was why I had to travel specifically for that instance. But it does, I mean, it upsets me because, like I said, I think everyone should have the right to choose, and not having access is not giving people the right to choose.
Right.
There are young moms that I've talked with and interacted with who would prefer to not be pregnant, um, but they don't have the funds for an abortion. They don't have the transportation for an abortion. And so they're forced into a pregnancy with a child that they do not fully want. And then they're forced into motherhood again, in a way where they're not able to be the mother that their child needs because that's not what they wanted for themselves in the first place. But yeah, I do believe that, like I said, it's just not giving women the right to choose when you don't make it accessible to everyone. And um which, going back to my previous point of forcing people into motherhood, I think that's one of the biggest ways that we're seeing is like making people drive 2 or 3 hours, or even some people having to fly to other states. And like, I couldn't imagine that for my experience, and I'm glad that I had the resources. And even after like keeping it from my parents, they know now, and I shared that with them, and they were even like, if you needed the funds, we would have given it to you. Like if you needed to, be driven there, we would have taken you there. And so they validated my choice and they validated my experience. But I also know that that's not realistic for everyone. A lot of people don't come from families where their choice would have been validated, and they, you know would have been supported in that. And I think that's another aspect that plays into people being forced into parenthood. And like you said, I've always thought that it wasn't fair for everything to be on women. As someone who was on birth control consecutively for 5 years, the damage that is done to my body. And then I also have a unique experience, I think, just because I am someone I've suffered a miscarriage. So all of those different perspectives and experiences really shaped my abortion experience, I think. But one thought that always like holds true, and all that I'm always thinking of is like, I feel grateful for my choice. But also like there's grief in my choice because I know other women who would have wanted to choose that aren't able to choose that. um and it's upsetting and it's disappointing. And raising a daughter, it does make me fearful for the future because, God forbid something would ever happen to her, or she would, life happens, and if she would end up in a situation where she would want to choose that, I would hope that the choice would still be available to her. So
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, I'm so glad that you did have family members willing and able to assist and support you. I know you didn't tell them later on, but do you feel like if you did, that would have affected things differently, whether it been your decision making or even just your support and your experience of being in isolation through it all?
I think that's a good question. I think that if I would have told my parents when it happened, I think that they would have been supportive, like they said, in the sense of like if I needed the, financial resources or being taken to my appointment, I think they would have been supportive in that. But I do, truthfully speaking, I think that they would have been upset. Just with like, I guess the thought of like, how could you be so dumb kind of thing? Like, you're living with us, you just had a baby, you're not working, your partner really is not working, doesn't have. And so I think as parents, they probably would have had a little bit of like, yeah, like what were you thinking? And so I think that would have clouded any kind of compassion or empathy. Not to say that they would have been intentionally or maliciously like mean or hurtful. Um, but when I talk about it with them now, they're like, we're so glad that you made that choice, because I think that your life would have been a lot different if you didn't make that choice. And like I said, I'm glad that I stuck with what I was feeling, and I stuck with what I knew to be true, which is what I wanted for myself. But when I talk about it with them now, things come up and I'll mention it or I'll reference it, and it kind of like is past me now, so I can talk about it lightly, and I can talk about it not in a joking way, because obviously it's not funny, but kind of in like a lighthearted way. Um, I know my mom had mentioned before that she wished I would have told her. But that just goes into a different conversation of feeling like you can't tell your parents things.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do feel like I would have been supported. It just would have looked different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think just talking about it out loud, similar to what you did with your family till now, is just such a impactful, powerful thing,
Yeah.
especially at a point now where you have overcome this situation. But it just brings so much awareness that literally anybody could be or have
Hmm.
experiences and you would never know. And I'm
Hmm.
sure it brought a lot of light and education to your parents as well, because I'm sure, like you said, they maybe would not have expected that. But
Hmm.
someone that they love and other people in the world, like, you would just never know.
Yeah, and I think that's true for a lot of people. One of the things I always tell people when the conversation of abortion comes up is like, we all love someone who's had an abortion, whether you know it or not. And the fact that there might be someone you don't know who's had an abortion, and you love them the same, and you interact with them the same, and you care for them, and you have the regard for them the same, I think shows that having an abortion doesn't turn you into this monster. It doesn't make you a bad person. We've all loved someone, whether you choose to believe it or not. Um, my maternal grandmother is very religious, very conservative in her beliefs, and does not at all support abortion. And it's like, girl, your granddaughter had an abortion. So, you know what I mean? Like you have this high horse that you think your politics puts you on. But in reality, the reality is that women all around you have gone through this experience, whether you choose to believe it or not. And that's just the way that life is. It's not all black and white. Um, so yeah, I just always like to remember that, like, we all have interacted with someone. I have very close friends who have had the same experience of, they've suffered a miscarriage and then they chose to terminate a pregnancy, or they chose to terminate a pregnancy and then they have a miscarriage, and it's two different situations and experiences of grief.
Mm.
um but they have like overlapping emotions and overlapping similarities, and it just all goes back to like, everyone's experience is unique. But at its core, everyone should have the right to choose what is best for their path in their life.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that also just, I think that being young parents, sometimes this is exacerbated too, right? You talked about the idea of others asking, how could you be so irresponsible, or the potential that they would ask that, right? And
Hmm.
I think that that is even accessing contraceptives. The
Hmm.
I mean, I remember being young and having to get Plan B several times.
Hmm.
I remember being like, how many times has this pharmacist seen?
Hmm.
And what are they thinking? Are they like, you again?
Hmm.
Like, and it's expensive, right? It was like, I feel like it was like $70 or something at the time. I don't know what it is now, but I just remember feeling so much shame. I didn't have a car at the time, so I'm walking, to
Hmm.
the pharmacy trying to get, and again, the responsibility fell on me to do that. But it's so, as a young person, you feel like you have this veil, like you said, this veil of shame on
Right.
you because of what others either may be thinking, they may potentially think about your decision making.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know, I think access to contraceptives is a big thing. People being able to ask their parents. I know you have talked about your experience of your parents like giving you contraceptives or putting you on contraceptives, but
Mm-hmm.
our story was not that. We never even discussed it. And so
Yeah.
first time ever even taking birth control was after I had my daughter. So,
But I will say though, it needs to be comprehensive
yeah.
because I had that conversation with my mom, but it was more so like I was a 16-year-old first time parent.
Yeah.
I'm putting my daughters on birth control, and that was that. It wasn't here's what ovulation is, here's what cycle tracking is, here, you know what I mean? Like there was no other education, there was no it was more so it was education in the sense that it was very like it came from a trauma point of view of like I don't want you to be a young mom so you're getting on birth control, instead of coming from the point of view of like if you were to get an STD, here's how you take care of it. If you were to, fall pregnant, here. And so I'm now 25, still learning how to track my cycle, still learning different things. You know what I mean? Still learning all of the things I wish I would have learned when I was 9 years old, 9, 10 years old, getting my period. Um, and so I think, like you said, having access to contraceptive, but also comprehensive sex ed. And I know there are people who have the politics of like, oh, well, if you teach, if you give kids or young girls access to birth control, then it'll make them want to have sex. I don't think that that's how that works. I think as someone who's put on birth control, it wasn't like, oh, now I'm gonna go have sex. It kind of actually made me more fearful because I didn't have cycles, I didn't have my period, I wasn't very in tune with my body, so I didn't know what my PMS symptoms were. That's why when I became pregnant, I didn't even know I was really pregnant without taking a test because I wasn't able to recognize how my body was feeling, how my body was changing.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's a mix of having access to contraceptives, having access to comprehensive sex education, um, all plays into this Roe v. Wade because it's not just a black and white issue of people having abortions or not. There's so many different layers to avoid women having abortions that could lessen the amount of women that we're seeing having abortions if we had access to other things.
Right. How are we having these conversations with our kids? Because we have kids. Well, I have one,
Mm-hmm.
like of reproductive age almost. And so
Mm-hmm.
how are we? I mean, I know that I have a lot of conversations in my house, and it's so funny because I'm so much of an open book. I think I was watching something the other day, and my daughter asked me, on the screen they said something about like being a sex something, right? Like essentially somebody who like has a lot of sex with a lot of people. And she was like,
Mm-hmm.
"Mom, in college were you that?" And I was like, "Girl, that's my business." But
Right.
it like because we have so many conversations, I think that that's why it opens the conversation to just say off the wall things or ask questions. She asked me like, "Have you ever smoked? Have you ever drank?" And then I give her the answer. She's like, "Oh, well, you asked." Like
Right.
having these conversations with our kids, like what both of you, like what are tips do you think are just opening up the conversation? At what point, you said when you were 9 you wish you had this conversation, but at what point, I think people are so scared to like for it to be so early, right?
Mhm.
And they talk about like even using the correct names of body parts when children are like forming language, and I totally agree with that. But when is a good time? How are for people out there who are grappling with this, for adults who have reproductive age children who are grappling with having these conversations, what do y'all think about just starting the conversation?
Scared.
Yeah.
I'm scared.
Yeah. Skin. Yeah. For me, it's a mixture of fear and also I think, like I said, legacy's only two. So there aren't many conversations that I'm having yet.
Mhm.
But I think one of the ways, like you said, like using the correct names for body parts, I think that like building a strong foundation of like confidence within her body and autonomy within her body, like I talked about before, Using the appropriate names, making sure that she knows that she could say no, teaching consent, teaching all of those things, I think helps build a strong foundation to be able to have those conversations about sex and safe practices. And because as a kid, it wasn't like our bodies didn't like belong to us. Like if we were at a family party, we had to kiss and hug everybody, like out of respect.
Yeah.
And so when I got to be a teenager who was having sex, there were times where I didn't necessarily want to do something, but I didn't know how to say no. And I didn't have the language or the confidence to be able to speak up. So I think it definitely starts at a young age where you have to build the confidence and build the trust and build just instill that in them young. That way, when they become 8 or 14 or 11 or those ages, it can get a little bit easier. But yeah, I think that those are just a few of the simple things I'm doing with Legacy now. But I think about that often, like when she becomes a teenager, I'm like, how am I going to deal with, if she does become pregnant? And I had the thought the other day of like, if she would become a teen mom, like there's trauma of becoming a teen parent and having to be pregnant, at such a early age and becoming a parent. And then there's also trauma with having an abortion at a young age and like having to pick, which trauma or which experience. And so yeah, that those are just like my inner thoughts and like my intrusive thoughts that I sometimes have as a parent. But um yeah, like Devon said, I'm scared. I'm scared. I'm open to all and any advice, but I'm scared.
I mean, yeah, I'm open to all and any advice because, my daughter is 8 going on 9 in January. So it's at that age where those conversations should at least be introduced. I think what makes me the most scared is the fact that I've already experienced it. I've had the abortion at a young age and I've had the young parenting at a young age. So, like, I know both sides. And not only would I be scared for her to experience that, but I feel like I would have some guilt with it. I feel like I am her sole foundation of an influential young woman and what that should be. So I'd want her to learn from me by doing better, but not necessarily, I don't want to ever shame it because even though I've made decisions that maybe weren't the best, like I really did make a huge turnaround. And if it wasn't for those decisions, I wouldn't be the person I am now. I wouldn't have accomplished so much. So it's just so hard to have to weigh those responsibilities and future outcomes at such a young age, and to have that put on her and knowing what that feels like is a lot of pressure and responsibility. But I do think, for one, as a tip, I want to try to shy away from unconsciously and unbiasedly shaming different topics, because I know that was a big thing in my household, even just the tone of how things were approached. And it may have not all the time been malicious or consciously, but that is just kind of being in control of how you word things. I think that's just such can be so powerful of its own, but being intentional of how you say things, especially with young children, girls or boys, is so important. So I think trying not to have shame and stigma and letting that be the first source of where she gets that from, because I didn't, and still to this day there's a lot of things I don't feel comfortable talking to my parents about.
Yeah.
And I would never want my daughter to feel like that, because I didn't have the best of friends or good, trustworthy friends that where I can even resort to them. So if she couldn't come to me or friends, being in isolation is terrible. It really is, especially with going through these traumatic experiences all alone with not even a fully developed brain to process it all. I mean, it can go into so many different realms and paths that people choose for for their life. So it's a lot. It's a lot. I mean, being a parent, even just thinking about this stuff is a lot for our children.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you on like not having shame and being intentional. Because one of the things I've been trying to practice, even with Legacy being so little, is I want to be the parent she can tell anything to. So I'm trying to become the parent she can tell anything to. And so that means when she's doing something she don't got no business doing, when she makes a mistake, when she, spills something, like intentionally trying to control my reactions and like not, I don't know how to explain it, but basically, like, not like you said, like not shaming her and not scaring her to the point where when she does make a mistake or when something is going on, she feels like she has to hide it or she can't come to me about it. Because that's a big one too. Like when I started having sex, I wasn't telling my mom I was having sex. I'm sure they knew, but we never had a conversation about it. I never went to her. So when I did have questions about even like normal body stuff, like different discharges, different smells, different, UTI, or like I was embarrassed and I didn't want to tell her because I'm like, I don't want to tell her. And she think, even though I was having sex, I obviously in my teenage head, I'm like, I don't want to tell her and she think I'm having sex. Like, so
Mhm.
it was just this shame of like, all right, I'm not going to tell her at all. And then inevitably it creates a bigger problem and just, contributes to being an adult now that has a hard time navigating those hard conversations. And now with a daughter myself, I'm like,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
stresses me. And she's only 2.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, if
Yeah.
I can shed any light, just kind of being on a little bit beyond where you all are in your parenting, I will say, for you, Justice, my daughter at 4 is when I really realized that body parts clicked for her.
Hmm.
We were in the grocery store and she yelled loudly, "Stop touching my penis," for the whole everyone to hear. Great. It was fantastic. So we pulled over and we talked about like, well, do you have a penis? What is a penis? Whatever. And then you, Divine, like Dynasty is in the age where I remember we were in COVID and Lyric was 8 or 9 and she just came in and was like, where do babies come from, essentially? And I gave her a very textbook answer. I was like, well, the sperm and the egg. And she was like, okay. And she like left it and she came back to me and she's like, essentially like, that's not the whole truth. Like what?
Hmm.
And so we had to have those conversations. And what I tell parents now is that, yes, the conversation, the buildup is scary because you always think of that thing where, like, I don't know about you all. It sounds like you had the similar experience to me where we didn't really talk about things. We weren't really sitting down talking about it. And so parents have this idea that it has to be this, like, okay, let's talk about the birds and the bees, sit down, we're going to have a class. And it's just not that, right? And it builds up so much anxiety. But really, like taking all the moments when your kid says something outlandish, like "stop touching my penis," that's a moment to educate. That's a moment to talk through something, and it's like actually makes it not so scary, right? And so
Hmm.
even when he says things now, I'm like, "Oh, girlfriend," like. But also, I don't feel much fear because I know that like she's honest. Whenever she has a question, she asks the question. Whenever she is thinking something, she says it. Her intrusive thoughts come out always.
Hmm.
I'm like, okay. But I think that that is important for people who are, again, parenting small children and older children, just to know that like it doesn't, sometimes it's scary because either our parents did it in a very weird way, like very like,
Hmm.
here, read this book way, or
Mhm.
sometimes our parents didn't have the conversation at all. So now we have nothing to go off of. Um,
Right.
but I think just really like starting with, like you said, Justice, bodily autonomy. It's your choice because I appreciate that our conversation has not just been about abortion or just been about pregnancy or whatever, but just the holistic thought. Like what I tell even teenagers is that engaging in sex is not necessarily just the physical like act of it. It's
Mhm.
very much so emotional too. I remember growing up feeling like every time I had sex with somebody, it felt like they took a piece of me with them. It
Mhm.
felt like I had to like grieve that relationship, even if it wasn't a relationship, or I had to like move on from something, or I had to reconcile with myself how I felt with myself. And I think that we don't talk enough about all the different pieces to growing up and,
Mhm.
stuff like that. So I
I think
appreciate
that's
y'all adding those
a
perspectives.
good podcast topic. I mean, I just even recently seen Justice posting about something like this, and I think just talking about how sex is different for
Hmm.
men and women, or like the stigma behind that of like women have body counts and men have, they just get it like that. And I think
Yeah.
that,
Mhm.
that just I'm gonna keep that in mind for next. But just the other day at the nail salon, my nail tech had asked Dynasty a question like, does she have any boyfriends? And I'm looking at Dynasty And I'm just thinking in my head, like, we don't do that. But she felt comfortable. It's so funny because I would have expected Dynasty to be like, no, and like scared of my reaction. And she said, no, she doesn't have any. And then the nail tech said, well, do you want one? And she looked at me and she said, yeah, I do. I was like, well, why do you want one? Like, why do you need one? She said, oh, well, maybe they can give me some money, And I'm just like, well, that's not what a relationship is, honey. But
Right.
that felt good to know that she felt comfortable saying that to me,
Right.
because naturally, I would have wanted to be like, we're not having that. And she knows that's how I feel, but she still felt comfortable to share her perspective. So that just gave me a little nugget that I'm doing something right and she's not scared of me. That's a big thing.
Definitely.
You are. You're a good mom. We're all good moms. We're all doing and but I just want to thank you, Justice, again for just joining us always. You always have like the best perspective and the best just kind of, I don't know, like gems for people. And just even the way you say it is so calming. And so I'm always like,
Thank you.
tell me more. And so we will, we already have more episodes in the works with you, so it's super exciting. But as always, we have a lot of information on the website. We have a lot on just family planning and making choices and making informed decisions. We know that right now is a hard time, especially when it's like you hear all the things, swirling around, or maybe you're getting judgment, or maybe you're having tough conversations with your family or with your friends or with yourself or with your children, whatever. And so take care of yourself as always. We're a resource. We are happy to answer questions. If you want to know more about any of the things that you heard, reach out. But until next time, bye, y'all.
Thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed the Up podcast, please subscribe, share, and leave a comment.
And visit youngunitedparents.org for the information, community, and resources young moms and dads need to thrive.